I hope you all had a nice evening. I know I sat in my room reading a book quietly. We did have fun networking. What was it? The spicy girls or the seasoned girls? I like spicy better. Today we have a full day. We're going to start with Adam Tescher. He's going to go over a variety of things, legislature, all sorts of things, and then he will be available for questions at the end. Everybody be sure to sign up for the door prize. This afternoon we have roundtable discussions, and really if you could, write on a slip of paper something that's really pressing on you and you'd like a roundtable discussion on. We will break into groups and do roundtables, or if it all else fails, we will just do a Q&A during that hour, and some of the spicy girls can answer those questions for you from their years of experience. So, without further ado, Adam Tescher.
Thank you. I am Adam Tescher. I'm the School Finance Officer with DPI. Some of my portfolios, the main one is administering the foundation aid, and we will spend some time on that today. Diane did send me a few questions that business managers had sent in, and it did seem most of them revolved around the foundation aid formula. I will also do some legislative updates and the changes to the formula that will be coming. But I also work on the NEDS Farm manual, the accounting manual, and collecting that 15-page financial report. I don't have much on this presentation, but I'm happy to answer the questions, or if you have questions, I can for sure look them up for you guys. And I am also took on the construction portfolio. So if you have any construction questions, I can answer those as well, but those aren't going to be touched as much in this presentation. First slide is, let's see how big, okay, it is decent size. Just the history of the foundation aid budget and the appropriations historically. And I have it up through this current biennium. And you can see back to the 13-15 biennium, which was really the first biennium of the current formula we're in. The state aid integrated formula payment had an appropriation of $1.75 billion. That has increased to $2.1 billion in this current biennium. And that is the state aid portion. That does not include the local funds that also make up your funding formula. Transportation has remained relatively flat, increased a little bit. With the on-time funding, the rapid enrollment grants have kind of rolled up into that integrated formula payment. And then the contract line, you can see how that's really been increasing significantly the last couple of years. And then the bottom section just shows the amount, or which funds make up the funding for those payments. We are majority general fund funded for that state aid. We do get some money from the state tuition fund, as well as the foundation aid stabilization fund. And you can see that state tuition fund has increased significantly, and that has really helped fund any increases to the per pupil rate that have come. The general fund has kind of remained relatively flat with that dip in the 17-19 slowdown of the oil. The first thing I want to talk about is we did have two new things that passed legislatively this year regarding the Cognia payment, that we were instructed to withhold that from school districts' payments, as well as the STARS rewrite. They were passed one during regular session, one during the special session. We did have a lot of questions on that. Those two payments were essentially payments by the school district, but DPI just withheld those funds. So it would be our recommendation that we would have an accounting journal entry, such as where you debit cash, you debit that expense for that Cognia or STARS rewrite, and then credit the total revenue for that month. This would be required if you plan on submitting STARS rewrite funding for ESSER, because you need to show an expense on your ledger that actually happened. I mean, I know what happened. If you need a receipt, I can send you a receipt for documentation. But this would be how we would expect that to be recorded, where you would debit cash, debit the expense, credit the revenue. So your revenue would actually be larger than your cash for that month. Any questions on that? I know I had quite a few emails on that. I probably wasn't as clear as I should have been when I sent that out, so I apologize for that, but just wanted to get that cleared up. Yes? So the Cognia withholding and the STARS withholding, we only withheld at one point, at one payment. So you'd only have to do it at that particular month that was withheld. Cognia will be withheld again next year. So that one will happen. The STARS rewrite, as it is passed now, was only a one-time withholding. My understanding is that only funded about 70% of the project. So I don't know if they have a plan to fund the last 30 to 40%. So just keep your ears open for that. I know it does involve NDIT, the SLEDS committee, so there are other entities that are involved in that we're hoping we can get some funding from them as well. This one is passed in the last legislative session that said school districts received a 1% and 1% increase to the per pupil payment. And this required that 70% of that increase be used for non-administrative increases for funding. So it says during the 21 through 23 biennium, the board of each school district shall use an amount equal to at least 70% of all new money received by the district, resulting from increases in the base integrated formula payment rate to increase the compensation paid to non-administrative personnel. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to the website out here. Let's see if it'll pop up. Well, I'll go to it at the end if I need to, but on our budgeting page, on the school finance page, I did put a blurb out there, and the new 22 through 23 payment worksheet budget, I added an extra section off to the side that would show what your state aid would have been had there not been any integrated formula increases. So you can see exactly what the increase was per the 1% increase. It does create challenges as we're working off a budget. We won't know the actual result of that until November once we pay your actual payment. So do the best you can, and we will get as close as we can, and then we'll just make sure that we're making that up if we have to do it a year or two later to recognize that. Any questions on that one? I think last year I had it on the payment worksheet, but I required, the districts actually had to go into the payment, per payment rate and change it to 10,036. Now I actually put a separate section on there, so it should be easier to see. Also in House Bill 1013, there was talk of administrative cost sharing. This was added to the cooperative agreements section of Century Code. So this would be for school districts that want to cooperate together to share both a superintendent and a business manager to provide some cost savings. The state would incentivize districts to do that and reimburse a certain amount of those salaries up to $300,000. And if two districts cooperate, you can get 10% of your business manager and superintendent salary reimbursed from the state. These are ESSER funds that are being used to do this. So it does expire June 30th, 2024. So this payment, if you were able to get that approved for essentially 2 years now. But I want to reiterate, it does require a cooperative agreement approved by DPI, so we need to get that done prior to the end of this fiscal year. If you want to start that next year, or if you just want it for 1 year, we can do it by the end of 2023 to get those approved. House Bill 1388 allowed school districts to operate virtual schools. Full-time students receive an ADM of 1, and then ADM will be prorated for less than full-time. We still require virtual schools to submit a calendar with hours, even though it may all be run differently, just because that's how we're going to use our proration to determine if a student were to leave during the year or move districts or whatever that might be. Open enrollment is not allowed in virtual academies, so you can't have a student open enroll into your virtual academy from another district. The only way for a district to accept a student that resides in another district is through a cost-sharing agreement, and then you can educate. So both districts have to agree on a compensation package. It's not like tuition where there is a formula laid out in Century Code. This is the two districts work it out. You guys can figure out how the funds are going to go. And then we would encourage you, if you're receiving these funds, that you quote them as other local revenue. It was very intentive that this money being exchanged would not be deducted from your funding formula. So if you would record it as tuition, it would be deducted in your funding formula as an in lieu of property tax. So if you do enter into these cost sharing agreements, please record that revenue as revenue from other local sources, other local revenue. Here are the increases to the weighting factors for our small schools. School districts with ADM of less than 245 will see some sort of increase to their small school weighting factor over the next 7 years. The factors for ADM 230 to 245 only go up 0.01 at one point during the next 7 years. Currently we're using the year one factors. The 22-23 school year will use the year two factors. So if you are in that range, these are what your factors will be, and then going forward you can see the additional funding and the additional weighted student units that your district will generate. This was passed to offset some of those transition minimum reductions. Now there are no offsets if your district is a transition minimum district and has greater than 245 ADM. At that point, they say you should be able to operate on the formula without getting the money from that transition minimum adjustment. Any questions on the small school weighting factors? Again, those will just continue to increase over the next 7 years. Well, 6 years now. The per pupil payment rate, currently we're getting paid on $10,136. Next year we'll go to $10,237. Transition maximum districts did not get any changes, so these are the districts that are below the $10,136. They did not receive any increases for this biennium. However, they still are putting those transition maximum districts to be on the formula in the same time frame of the transition minimum. So instead of doing it over 7 years, the maximums are going to be over 5 years. It'll be the last 5 years. They added new weighting factors. If you're a reorganized district that still operates 2 plants that are greater than 19 miles apart. As it is worded in law right now, that is only a 1-year change. It does not continue on. It specifically says for the 22-23 school year. It's not beginning 22-23 school year. So just keep that in mind, that if you operate 2 plants that are at least 19 miles apart, those plants will basically get a weighting factor as if they were their own district still. And then with that small school weighting factor that we had here, the state used to have a separate weighting factor for elementary districts. That is no longer the case. They are now on this scale, but we need to impute their ADM into what they would be if they were a K-12 district. And to do that, we take their ADM, divide it by 0.6, and that'll put them on this scale somewhere. So instead of operating 2 different small school weighting factor tables, everyone is on one. We just need to impute that ADM into a K-12 ADM. It is important to note that in the in lieu of property tax, they did change it to where if you levy a sinking and interest levy, that your in lieu of property tax deduction will actually be less than 75%, and it will be based off your levies and the percent of that levy. And I'll go through an example of this later so you can see exactly how it calculates. But in your budget worksheet, The law specifically requires us to use 2020 for this full biennium. Next biennium we'll use the 2022 tax levy. The reason we do this and not update it every year is because it is almost impossible to budget which districts will pass a sinking and interest levy, which will create funding discrepancies in our budget. So this way we know what the 2020 levy was for the whole year, whole biennium. Next biennium we'll know what the 2022 levies are. So that'll just allow for some budgeting, but you may have a 1-year delay of when that implements, depending on when you pass that bond election. We will continue with that 15% reduction on the transition minimums. This was the first year of that. It will continue next year and going forward. So if you are a transition minimum district, just beware that those cuts are coming. I did run some numbers for OMB this morning. Currently, we have 171 school districts that are foundation aid school districts. We have 90 districts that are transition minimum districts. So there are more transition minimum districts than not. So odds are the district is on it. So please be aware if you are a transition minimum district. I'll show where that's at also on the payment worksheet when we get to it. It is important to note that it's still only of those, 55% of school districts that aren't, it is only about 22% of students in the state that are on that transition minimum. So it is our smaller districts that are mostly affected by it, not all districts. And then if your district is unable to get to the 60 mil increase because of the 12% cap in dollars each year, there is a percentage increase that would be for the difference. It was 20% this year of what you can actually levy in 60 mils. Next year it'll go to 40. Next biennium it'll go 60, 80, and 100. And now everyone will be at 60 mils. So if you aren't able to get there, be sure to work with myself and your county, and we can work on, because now you can actually levy greater than a 12% increase in dollars if you are prohibited from getting to that 60 mils due to current century code. One of the questions that was talked about was canceling school days. And the question was, why are we required to make these up if we have enough hours already built into our calendar? So in House Bill 1232, the school district, if a school district must cancel class, virtual instruction may be used to account for those hours. We also only require 962 hours, 962 and a half hours for elementary students and 1,050 hours for high school students. Many of our calendars exceed those by a couple hundred hours. So canceling those days, school districts would not necessarily be required to make those up. DPI's guidance, we sent out formal documentation to the administrators that says educational leaders must be cognizant of canceling instructional hours and not making them up because of the impact on student learning and teacher contractual days. All schools should make every effort to make up canceled hours of instruction, as those hours were approved by the public school and their governing boards, and districts must be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So that was some guidance we put out. It's just, you don't have to, this is not a requirement, but we believe it would be good practice. Part of the concern is if the legislature feels that districts are canceling a bunch of class and not making them up, they may remove that hours requirement. I don't think they want to, but if they would get that inkling that, hey, we're just canceling class and not making up and only going to school for, we're missing a week or 2 weeks of school depending on where you were at in the storm, they may go back to days. So we just want to make sure that we can keep that flexibility with hours and that we're not abusing the system. Any questions on that? As long as you're making your hours, you are not required to do it, but we do think it is good practice. Ending fund balance has been something I've had a lot of questions on. I should have removed it from the payment worksheet just to make it more clear. I left it in there and just left it at 0, but I probably should have removed it just to make it more clear. But there will be no ending fund balance offset for this biennium in the payment worksheet. So the 21-22 or the 22-23 payment year. That being said, as of right now, for the 23-24 payment year, there will be one, which would be your June 30th ending fund balance of 2023. So this year you don't have to worry about it, but next year we would need to worry about it because that's going to enter into your 23-24 payment year. So just to be aware of that, you got this year, don't worry about the ending fund, how much you're carrying. I should probably rephrase that. I'm not going to say don't worry about it, because if legislatures see that you've got a lot of money, there may be some changes to that. I should probably rephrase that. I apologize. But it will not affect your payment for the 22-23 school year. Yes?
Is the percent still the same?
So the question was if the percent is still the same, and yes, they have not made any changes from the 35% plus $50,000. They just delayed it for this biennium. And a big factor was the ESSER funds that are coming in. And then there was 2269, which provides foundation aid payments to post-secondary institutions that run a transitional program for students that have graduated from a North Dakota public school and that are on an IEP. So if a student graduates on an IEP and they attend one of these approved programs, that program can receive some foundation aid money, as that student is eligible to receive foundation aid money through K-12 up to the age of 21. They now just moved it on to this transitional program that a few of our post-secondary institutions are operating. We did put the application out on our website, and I think it'll go out in the blast either last week or this week, just to know that this is coming and allow those institutions to apply. We're working on some communication to the post-secondary schools. Transportation. This has been another one that we've gotten a lot of questions on, so I just want to maybe provide a little more clarity on it. So here's the law that was passed. A school district may not receive transportation aid disbursements under subdivision A of subsection 1. That refers to the miles, does not refer to the rides, it refers to the miles. For transporting students who are participating in open enrollment or who are enrolled pursuant to a written contract entered by the sending district and admitting district, which waives the charge and collection of tuition. So those tuition waivers, we view that very similarly to open enrollment, other than the resident district needs to approve those. Everything else is basically the same as an open enrollment. That you cannot claim any additional miles for those students. So we are going to change up that transportation report just a little bit. At first we were just going to have districts report only the allowable miles. So if you had an open enrolled student, just not to put it in there. However, we really felt that would throw off some of our historic data and how much transportation North Dakota is providing. So we are going to have a reimbursable miles, which would be any resident student that you are transporting. Or if you have a tuition paid student, you can transport those students and report the miles. This will happen a lot. Medora only has Billings County has a K-8 school, so their 9 through 12 graders must be tuitioned into another district where they are required to pay. Those students, when you transport them, can be claimed for miles. Yes?
What about homeless students who are required to transport them if they're outside their district?
The question was, what about homeless schools and the requirement to transport them outside their district? So they are enrolled through an open enrollment agreement.
They become homeless and displaced, and they end up outside of our school district. According to the Evento, you have to provide transportation to their home district, which is the school they originally enrolled in.
Okay, that is a new one to me, so I apologize. Thank you. I am going to work with our McKinney-Vento person. I'm just trying to process this. So they're living outside of another district, and we're required to educate them within what was originally their.
McKinney-Vento states that if they are displaced and have
When they go homeless, is this usually temporary, or is, I mean, it's probably hard to tell that, answer that question. Okay. I will do some research on that because it specifically says for open enrolled, and if you move out of the district to attend back to you should be open enrolling if you have a new resident district, because every student will have a district of residence. Okay, I will do some research on that. Thank you for that question. I do appreciate that. I'll get with our homeless person and then work with Steve and figure out, get some guidance out to you guys regarding those students. Thank you. We're going to add, so we're going to have the reimbursable miles, which will be your transporting your resident students. We're going to add a field for your non-reimbursable miles. These would be any additional miles that you add on to a route or create a whole new route if it's specifically for open enrollment, or adding on miles for an open enrolled student. So our guidance, and Steve's been working on blast articles, and I'm going to try and get them all together and send them out in an email with all of them combined, is what would your route look like if you didn't have any open enrolled students on there? If you transport an open enrolled student in with the same route as your resident students, how many miles are you adding on? Those additional miles should be recorded as non-reimbursable miles. The law, while it was discussed during the interim committee about not reimbursing outside of district lines, the law specifically says anything for open enrollment. So even if you have to go 5 miles within your district lines and an additional 10 miles outside your district lines, that whole 15 miles would not be reimbursable under the law as it is written. And then your total miles would be your total route. So that way we can still collect the total number of miles that are being transported for students. Again, you can still include rides as they feel a student's going to get transported, whether it's within or without, so you still get that 30 cents a head count for those. Are there any other questions? Thank you for the McKinney-Vento question. I will work on that. I know this is kind of confusing. Are districts able to track their miles for open enrollment if they are transporting open enrolled students? I know some districts run a dedicated bus for open enrolled students. That entire dedicated bus route would not be reimbursable for miles. The transportation funding for this biennium, we had an appropriation of $58.1 million. I came up with that estimate by using the 2018-19 miles in a ride, comparing it to the 19-20, which was a shortened year, so I only used 75% of that and adjusted it to what the district would have ran if it was a full year, and used the rates and determined that we needed about an extra 1.6 million on top of what was paid in 18-19. So transportation now, when you submit your report, I'm comparing your previous year's miles and rides compared to your 18-19 miles and rides, which was really the last year prior to the pandemic, the last full year prior to the pandemic. I will determine which one of those years creates a larger reimbursement for your school district, and I will use those miles and rides in your payment worksheet. Again, using the higher of the two, I estimated it would cost an extra 1.6 million. In year one, it was $1 million. So I was a little underestimating. More districts were using their 2020, 2021 miles and rides than I had anticipated. And the law only allowed me to distribute 50% of the appropriation in the first year of the biennium. So on your November payment, I did pull some money back out of your transportation. There was a manual adjustment on your voucher so I could get under that 50%. Upon further review and further questioning, we did have some other districts that reduced miles and rides, which freed up some more money. And on your May 1st payment that you just received, or you may have received it the last day of April, we did redistribute some of that transportation adjustment to get us to exactly 50% of the appropriation. So we will run this again for next year. We'll see where we're at. If we're over 50%, we'll pull it back again. Because we are not allowed to spend over $58.1 million in transportation. I don't know what that will look like with the reduction in the open enrollment, because that open enrollment really didn't come into effect until this current school year with the funding for those miles. So if that does reduce some of them, more districts might revert to their 18, 19 miles and rides.
And then, do you know what their end game is or what their thinking is with this transportation? Because they seem to be just taking, we get less and less, making more rules, harder and harder for people to get a CDL and more expensive. I mean, what are they trying to do here? What is their point? Do they just not want us to run buses anymore? Everybody bring their kid to school? Or because we can't afford as a district to pay. I mean, everything is getting cut everywhere. So how are we supposed to keep our doors open if we just keep taking everything away?
Yeah, so the end game of the transportation, there's really two entities we need to look at with this. The federal government is the ones that is requiring the CDL training, the clearinghouse, all that stuff. That is federally mandated. That is not a state mandate. So yes, that is going to create more difficulties recruiting new bus drivers to get a CDL. I probably should have brought Steve to answer all the requirements of that. He knows that better than me, but you basically have to have like a behind the wheel almost training for these new CDL drivers. And that's all CDL drivers, not just school bus drivers. If you want to drive a semi, you need to do this now too. So that is a federal requirement. The state wanted to make a push. Some of the legislatures, a few of them, were concerned that he lived on a road and he saw 3 different school district buses pass by his house. And he really felt, why are we paying 3 different school districts the money to travel the same route? So he really pushed to say, let's only transport within that district, only pay for transportation within that district. We're not going to stop them from going out of district to get those students if they want, but we shouldn't be funding them with state dollars and funding the same route to 3 different school districts. I understand they're not the exact same route, and of that, that's how this law got passed for open enrollment. And it's just like, we're not going to pay for open enrollment. You can collect the $10,000 for them, but you're not going to get the transportation funding for those. As far as the appropriation goes, this might go into a little bit of a history lesson, so hopefully I don't take too long on this. When I first started at the department in 2015, the state used to provide an amount, and I could go back to that appropriation, I think it was $55 million for transportation. DPI created a rate to allocate that out, and then if there's any remaining funds left, that just got sent out to the school district. So they were spending $55 million in transportation no matter what, high or low. DPI just created the rate to try and proportionally allocate that out to the school districts. Well, in the 15 through 17 biennium, when the oil really crashed, there was $3 million left in that fund, and the legislature came in with an emergency clause saying, whoa, whoa, don't send that out to school districts, we need that money. And ever since that time, they have no longer allowed the additional money to go back to the school districts as it was in the first biennium. So now when they give me a dollar amount to say, you're going to get $58 million in transportation revenue, I could create rates that would keep us significantly under that, and we kind of send more money back, or I can try and get us as close as we can to that $58 million, but if we go over, we got to pull some of that back. But that way we're not sending money back to the general fund for transportation. So it does create it harder to budget, but I am really trying to get as close to that $58 million and not leaving $3, $4, $5 million left in that funding line. So then you're really getting shorted more. But it does create budgeting difficulties. But that's kind of been my thought process in how I've been setting those rates. Yes?
So do you know if there's any talk from our legislatures because of all the changes in CDL requirements and difficulty in finding bus drivers? Is there any talk about giving us a bigger incentive for transportation? Because in North Dakota, even not having in-town routes is really difficult when you look at the weather. And we have tried to cut our city routes, which is where most of our riders are now. But we get a lot of kickback from our parents for that. So do you know where the legislature's at with that? Should we be talking to our legislators? Is there encouragement? Because, I calculate I would get about 30% of my actual costs in transportation funding in the state.
This is a hot topic within the legislature, and I will tell you there are legislators that are on both sides of the coin. There are some that don't think we should pay for any transportation funding because transportation is not required. There are certain exceptions to that, but for the most part, transporting a kid to and from school is not a requirement in North Dakota law. So there are some that say we shouldn't pay a dime for that. There are some that want to pay more, so that are really saying we need to get these kids in school, providing that busing will get these kids to school. So I would encourage you to reach out to your local legislators and say, hey, we cannot maintain this transportation, or show them data. They'd like data saying, here's what I got from the state, from DPI for transportation. Here are my costs. This is not sustainable. And be prepared for questions about open enrollment and how you're transporting those kids and how many students are you picking up that aren't in your district? How many additional miles are you doing there? So just be prepared for those type of questions. Yeah, it has been a very hot topic, and even just getting this open enrollment was debated quite a bit in the interim committees about whether this should be changed or not. So it's being talked about. I don't know if I have the answer to say it goes both ways.
That's good information to take back. It's my first question. If I get pushed back from legislators, maybe how many of you walk to work every day?
And a lot of them will say it's the parents' job. I mean, that's going to be their response. But we all know all the different situations there are. Yes.
So then when we get an open enrollment or a tuition waiver, are we allowed to tell them that you have to meet us at the closest spot on our route? That we don't get paid going out of district. We're 10 miles from your house. That's where you have to meet us every day?
Potentially, transportation again is not required. So you could accept the open enrollment and say we're not providing transportation.
They're going to kill open enrollment and tuition waivers, and if that's their goal, then they're going about it the right way.
And I don't believe that was the goal. I believe it was the transportation. So again, I would encourage you to meet with them. You would not be allowed for open enrollment to even do the family paid. It says, if you read in there, it said subsection 1 and subsection 3. This 3 was regarding the family pay. So that would be, we couldn't contract with them to, the 50 cents a mile for those would not be allowed either. So if they want to open enroll to another district, that's their choice, but the legislator's saying they got to get there, or the school district pick them up. I think they have some thought process that say you're getting $10,136 for that kid. Use that money to transport. We understand that the $10,036 is used to educate, but so that's kind of the thought process behind it. Again, I would encourage you to reach out to them to work on that funding. And I'll keep doing statewide analysis of the funding we're distributing versus the transportation expenses that come in through the financial reports at your end. Because right now we go anywhere from 45 to 55% as a state. The other thing I wanted to mention on this, we have seen a lot of changes in transportation routes because of all the difficulty, and we've had school districts stop busing in certain areas. The 90% cap of your transportation expenditures is still in effect, and we are only looking at the prior year for your transportation expenditures. So if you quit transportation for this school year, the 2021 school year, which would be paid on your next year's payment report, we will revert to your 19 miles and rides and put that on your worksheet, but your cap of how much you can get of your actual transportation expenditures will look at your 2022 financial report to say how much did they actually spend on transportation. If you weren't providing, your spend is probably going to be down, and then your reimbursement is capped at 90% of your total expenditures. So just to keep that in mind, if you are one of those districts that said we quit transportation, we'll still get paid off at 18-19. There is that cap still in there to ensure that we're not reimbursing more than what the districts are spending. This is just an overview of the payments that go out and how much goes out each month. The formula is designed to front load payments. 60% of the payments go out in the first 4 months. come the December 1st payment, there is a significant reduction in your allocation. Again, so we're paying 60% in the first 4 months, the last 5 months get 40%. So every year the December payment comes out, it's significantly reduced as it is scheduled to be, and I'll get questions, what did I do wrong? Why is my payment down? Just beware, that is a scheduled reduction. And the timing of that was strategic, as that is about the time property tax payments will start coming into your district. So that is why they decided to front load those payments to get you through the first semester, or first 4 months there, and then it is reduced. So just keep that in mind when you do see that reduction in your monthly payment. The yearly payment will still be the same. Just for the budget for the 22-23 year, just so you know how I came up with my budget. Budgeting for 171 school districts is a very difficult task. I don't see the students coming in and out every day. So just so you can kind of see where I'm coming from, and we do that worksheet out online so you can plug in any potential changes that you think might happen. So to project your ADM, I look at your September 10th enrollment date. You have enrollment submitted 2 times a year, once on September 10th, and we count how many kids you had enrolled on, it's submitted on September 15th, and we count how many kids were enrolled in your district on September 10th. I use that count to determine what your ADM. If you had 500 kids, K-12, on September 10th, that is what I'm going to use to project your ADM. We know kids come and go throughout the year. We don't get a submitted report, so we don't change that throughout the year. But that's something that's important for business managers and whoever's working on the budgeting to work with that enrollment person to know what's kind of going on within their district if we are high or low on that projection. The taxable valuation for the next school year uses the 2021 taxable value, which we got in December, so that will not change unless you spot an error if the county submitted it wrong. So be sure you check that. It is, unfortunately, we don't have a STARS system for counties. That's only a school district system. So anything we collect from the county is a very paper process. And when you have paper processes, mistakes can happen. So be sure to check that taxable valuation. On-time funding is projected using the projected fall enrollments for next year. We continue to use projections to forecast future enrollments. We use what we call a survival cohort routine, and essentially we take all the first graders, we advance them to second graders to third graders, and we look back a certain number of period of years to see what percentage of actually first graders made it to the second grade, what second graders made it to the third grade, and we apply that going forward. Kindergarten being by far the hardest class to project. The only hard data that we have projected at is birth, which is 5 years prior, 6 years prior, and that's also on a calendar year versus a school fiscal year. So it does create some challenges there. So the kindergarten projections are shaky at best.
Alan?
Yes.
Has the state done any analysis of the census the last 5 years in North Dakota to know if we're trending up in childbirths, to know what we project going forward?
So I collect from the census. They do a publication every year of the births in North Dakota. I pull that. The births take a significant decrease about 3 years ago. So as I look into the 23 through 25 biennium, we're really starting to project flattened enrollments as a state. From about 2,000 to 2,500 student increase, we're scaling that back to about 1,300 to 1,700. So that is providing some savings. Now, again, that is different by every district. There's different demographics, but as a state, that's how we're looking there. I'll do a little, I'm gonna have to speed up here a little bit. I'm gonna spend a little time on the on-time funding and that new on-time adjustment. I'm still getting quite a few questions on that. And then most of the other payments we just use based off of this. Any other variables we use off of this current year. The only difference in that is if your district receives an oil and gas distribution, we go out to the state treasurer's website. They post all the distributions to school districts. I took that as of December 31st and used that to project how much oil and gas money you'll get for the rest of the year. But if there are changes throughout the year, be sure that you recognize that, because that will affect your payment. We do our best to only make one set of projections. I don't want to have 4 or 5 different projections rolling around, because that does create a lot of confusion. We try and get them out early enough. So just be aware that those things do change. You're in lieu of property taxes. Those can go up or down. Sometimes wind farms come online that I wasn't aware of, and I didn't project those increases. So here's, again, I used this last year in the presentation. I thought I'd bring it again. I didn't update the years, but this is going to be the same concept going on in perpetuity as long as we have on-time funding, or until the legislature makes changes to this formula. So in this example, you can see the previous year's ADM of 645. That will get paid on lines 2 through 7 in the funding formula of the next year. ADM will still get paid off the prior year. Lines 12 and 13 in your worksheet are where the on-time adjustments happen. So in this district, their fall enrollment ended up being 673, which was an increase of 27.5 from their previous year ADM. That goes on line 12. When I do your projection for the following year, line 13 is always going to be a 0, because I use fall enrollment to project ADM. However, we know that's usually not the case. The number of kids you had enrolled on September 10th is not your ADM at the end of the year. So in this case, line 13 for my projected worksheet for next year is 0. And then I'm projecting the fall enrollment to come down, so they won't get on-time funding as a projection the following year. Now in November, when we true this up to actual, so that's when you first see your actual payment for the year, and we get the hard data and it's reviewed and audited, the school, in this case, the school district did lose some students. They started with 673 on September 10th. They ended the year with 668, which was a decrease of 4.82 students. That adjustment goes on line 13. And then when I compare their fall enrollment to the previous year's ADM up on the top, they went down. So they're not getting an on-time payment for that year because their fall enrollment was down. This is the scenario that districts really need to be aware of, because they are going to get paid. They're going to, essentially what happened is we overpaid you for your on-time funding. We paid you as if you had 673, you ended up with 668. We have to pull that money back. And there could be, if that is significant, you could see some significant changes in your funding and some decreases in your funding and your number of students you're getting paid for. So that's kind of the scenario that everyone needs to be aware of if they got that on-time funding payment and then their enrollment goes down, because they're not getting the next on-time funding to make up for that. But it goes the other way too. So in this case, their ADM ended up being greater than their fall enrollment. They gained some students throughout the year. Line 13, we adjusted 7.25, saying we underpaid you for on-time funding. We are going to give you that money. You earned that money, you educated those students, you are going to get that funding. And in this scenario, in that fall enrollment, they increased more, so they got another on-time payment. I want to be clear that line 13 is only used if line 12 is used in the prior year. So if you look at your 21-22 payment worksheet and you have an adjustment on line 12, know that there will be a line 13 adjustment next year. My budget will show 0 because I'm using that fall enrollment to protect ADM. But you will want to have an idea if your ADM did increase or decrease, so you can plug that into your payment worksheet. If line 12 is 0, you did not get on-time funding and there is no adjustment. You're just staying off the on-time funding adjustment. There was talk about trying to figure it in, but there's just too many numbers, then you'd have to pay it off the ADM and not the K-12, and we'd have so many different formulas going on, and then it gets really complex. So if you don't get the on-time funding, you're not going to get the on-time funding adjustment, even if you do grow up through a couple students throughout the year. And just some more, this is the scenario I kind of just talked about. There was no adjustment in line 13 of the second year. I guess it is projected, but because there was nothing on line 12 of the previous year, the first year. So again, the years are from last year, but this could be applied for any 2 years going forward. So it is kind of a complex calculation. I'm happy to work with you if you guys have any questions. Just wanted to kind of make sure that those line 12 and 13s are becoming more clear, as it is a fairly confusing calculation. Just want to talk through the transition payments and how those are calculated. So the top half of this screenshot would be the very bottom of page 2 of your payment worksheet. The baseline is established in section F, and it was established using the 1819 year that was set in law. So in this school district, they were an on the formula district back in 1819. They were getting paid $9,646. Their weighted student units were 329. However, in this current school year, their weighted student units dropped to 305. So they are losing students. The law says your total funding can't fall below the 3.1 million that's established on line 64. And the 3.1 million flows down to line 73, which then flows back up to the bottom of the first page to where we put in the transition minimum adjustment. So in this district, the total formula payment, if they were on the district, would be 3.1 million, 3.123 million. However, the transition minimum says they actually can't fall below 3.182, which is a higher number. It's a difference of $60,000, $59,000. We are now reducing that $60,000 difference by 30%, and the change is now only $41,000. That 70% will go down to 55%, 40% until that hits 0, and there will be no more transition minimum. So that's going to keep being phased out. So that is one scenario of how a school district becomes a transition minimum payment district. You look at that bottom of page 12, or excuse me, bottom of page 2 for the calculation, and it flows up into your formula at the bottom of page 1. Page 2 of that payment worksheet is a lot of the supporting details that make up the page 1 calculation. Another transition minimum scenario is this district has increased students, but in 1819 they were a transition minimum district that was getting funded at $13,000 a student. So that payment rate goes into 69. Their first 229 weighted student units gets paid at that $13,000. That flows down from the top, but they've gained an additional 10 students since 1819. Those additional 10 students they gain only get paid at the per pupil rate of next year would be $10,237. So that creates an adjustment of 3.181 million, which is great. We'll compare that to the 3 million at the top, which is the dollar one, which we got paid on last time, the last example. And 3.81 goes to line 75, which then flows up to the bottom of page 1 into the formula adjustments. Again, so in this district, if they were an on the formula district, they would get $2.4 million. The law says, hey, they can't fall below 3.1. That difference is $716,000. That is being reduced by 30% to $500,000. So that is how that transition minimum calculation works, why a district might be on the transition minimum. Essentially, when this formula was created in the 13-15 biennium, they didn't want to cut a bunch of districts' funding over 1 year, because if they were getting funded at $13,000 a kid then, and we're going to move it down to $8,800, $5,000 student payment decrease, creates a lot of issues. So it has been phased out since 13 and has been spread out. But after 8 years, they felt it hadn't made enough progress, so they really started accelerating it in the next 7. This is where I talked about the mill levy in lieu of revenue. So in both these scenarios, the district is getting $104,000 in lieu of property tax revenue. That's at the bottom, I totaled that. For the top district that doesn't levy any sinking and interest levy, they have $78,000 of that money reduced from their funding formula. That flows up into the bottom of page 1 and counts us towards that $10,136 a kid. Scenario 2 is a district that receives the same amount of money, and I put in a sinking and interest levy of 37 mils. More than likely your total levy would actually go up by 37 mills too, unless you found other ways to cut those, but which has basically 67% of their mills are not part of that sinking in interest. That first gets applied to the total revenue, and then we apply the 75% reduction. So in this scenario, that district is only getting $52,000 reduced from their funding formula versus the $78,000 as part of that $10,000 payment. So that is where you can see having a sinking in interest levy does gain you more state dollars. The intent of the legislature was to have that money, that difference of $26,000, help offset the payment of your debt, your bond payments. You're getting to keep that money. That money should go there. Not required. That was talked about by many legislatures though when they passed this law. So here's the property tax section where we have the 20% and 40% that will continue to increase. This is for the districts that are unable to get to 60 mills due to the 12% increase cap they are allowed in dollars. So in this scenario, 21-22, taxable valuation of just under 80 million. If they levied 60 mills, that would be 4.7 million. However, the law only requires them, the max they can go is 2.6 per the 12% increase in dollars from the previous year. However, they're trying to accelerate districts to get to that 60 mills faster. So at this year it was at 20%. So the difference between 4.7 and 2.6, they were about $2 million short. We took 20% of that, 400,000, and added it in. So now they're getting deducted 3.1 million versus the 2.6. And that will continue going forward. That 3.1 that comes from 21-22 flows down. 12% above that is 3.4 million for the 22-23 school year. Their taxable valuation increased. So 60 mills is now 5 million. The difference between the 3.4 and the 5 million is $1.5 million. We're at 40% of that next year, or an extra $600,000 that they can go on top of the 12% increase to get to a $4 million. And this will keep continuing. The 40% will change to 60%, to 80%, to 100%, and every school district will be at 60 mills. You are allowed to levy that additional 600,000, 400,000 on top of your 12% increase in dollars. So that's what's important, that you work with me and your county, and we'll make sure we're getting that calculation done correctly. And then my last slide, so getting right here to the end. I did work with Legislative Council and OMB on the cost to continue into next biennium. There's actually, for the first time since I started, a negative cost to continue. That will actually be cheaper if we didn't make any changes to what's already been passed. All the laws that have already been passed, and I carried those forward, did our taxable valuation budget increases, our student budget increases, that will actually save $18 million in funding. Again, a result of that, smaller enrollment increase I'm projecting. The increases in the property tax deduction, local property taxes will account for more of the funding formula, so the state saves money there. Taxable valuations we're still projecting to continue to increase. And then the reductions of those transition minimums, those are all saving state money. So hopefully this will allow availability for the district or the legislature to have bigger per pupil payment increases to help offset some of those reductions. Some of the other questions that came across were, changes to the 60 mills. I've had a lot of questions from legislators. What's it going to cost if we change this to 30 mills? What that looks like. So we've been working on that. I hear it from both sides. Some of the legislators really want to do property tax reduction. Some legislators say we used to be at 185 mills, we're at 60, we already got 115 mills, and you want more. And they were really looking at the income tax side of things. So I don't know where it's all going to shake out, but 30 mills has been the number that has most often been referred to when discussing property tax relief. The other thing that they are looking at is freezing the taxable valuation per the funding formula, not necessarily property owners' taxable valuation, but as taxable valuations increase, that 60 mills increases significantly too, and property owners are seeing that increase on their tax statement. Even though they're still at 60 mills, it's still more dollars. So they're talking about potentially freezing that taxable valuation. Things that considers though is that increases the cost to continue, things like that. So there's more state money going towards property tax relief. Then the other question is how to combat inflation. Inflation is obviously a hot topic. I don't know if I have an answer for you. If we're having 7, 8, 9, 10% inflation percentages, obviously that's going to create strain on budgets, all budgets. I don't know if anyone had anything to add to this. I didn't really have a great answer for this question. Obviously, the best thing that I believe business managers and school districts can do is take actual data to their legislators saying, hey, this is what it's costing us now. We got to find a way to fund this. Whether it be school foods, whether it be curriculum, teacher pay, whatever that case is to take that data and show them and say, hey, this is what we need. A 1% increase isn't going to do it when we're facing 7% increase in inflation. I think 7% increase would be tough to get on a per pupil payment rate, but again, the more data you can show them, the better. Now I can show them statewide roll-ups, but that doesn't really do necessarily justice of what it's costing that individual school district. And I get summaries. I don't get the individual detail where you can specifically say, you know, it was textbooks or it was computers or it was internet or whatever it is. I'm getting very rolled up, summarized information. I will get that data and I will collect it. And when that gets asked, I will present it as asked for.
Adam, has there been any conversation from legislatures on a per pupil increase? Do you know in the interim what they're discussing?
So for the interim committee, I have not been told anything about what they're considering. I still think it's early and they're trying to figure out what the state revenues are available. It does seem like state revenues are coming in above projected. Oil and gas is high. That there is more money available than they were originally projected, but I have not heard a percentage of what they're discussing at this point. That was my last slide, and that puts us at 10:02. I was at one point going to go up to our website and do the budgeting, but it's where it always is under school finances. There's a budgeting, I call it an accordion menu, where you can click it, it expands down. I put a payment worksheet out there, I think at the beginning of this week, along with that non-administrative salary piece of law, and it can show you exactly how much money you should have increases for non-administrative personnel. Just to make that a little easier and a little more clear. I think there may be a report we have to do, so we might be reaching out to school districts just to say, hey, can you show me the data of where you provided increases to certain personnel? I mean, we do collect a lot of that stuff, so I'll see what I can pull from our system, but a lot of times we collect it at the end of the year, and it would be too late for our report. So, any other questions for me? Yes.
I do. We're starting preschool next year, and the original thought by the board was to have parents just bring their kids. And of course, with most households being two working parents, and you're not going to let a 3-year-old walk to school. The question has come out, and I don't know the answer because I haven't had to worry about it. Can you charge for those transportation? And can you charge different rates? So if I have kids at a daycare 3 blocks away versus somebody who's 12 miles north of me.
I would say
You
for
can thank Paul Sturman for this question.
Could be on or off the record.
we would say that you shouldn't be claiming those miles, because the state at this time recognizes pre-K special education and K-12 towards our cost of instruction. That's what the transportation is for. So those miles shouldn't be reported in your transportation report for transporting. I hate to call all pre-K daycare, but that's kind of how it's viewed right now at the state. It's not part of our cost of education. So I don't see why there would be a problem charging for those students transportation, because you cannot, we would not allow those miles to be reported to the state for reimbursement.
So
I don't want to speak in absolute, but I mean, as long as you can justify, you know, a formula of how you're doing it, as long as you're not, I mean, obviously you got to look at other things like discrimination type things that could be viewed if you're just arbitrarily charging certain kids more. But if you have a formula of how you're doing that, I just can't think of a reason why you couldn't.
Thank you.
With that, would you have to show that income then, or that revenue as like another local source again?
Yes, I would show that, but again, that's not tuition, so that's not going to affect any funding. But that's money that's hitting your books, and we would be expected to see that as an other local revenue. I'd have to check if we have a specific transportation code for that or not, but yeah, we would expect to see that in the financial report.
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
We're going non-operating next year, waiting for the consolidation vote with McCluskey. Are our kids going to McCluskey next year considered open enrolled students in regards to transportation?
No, they are not. So the law prohibits a student from open enrolling if that school district does not offer grade levels. So a lot of times, like I mentioned Billings County earlier, the 9 through 12 cannot open enroll. They have to be tuitioned in, and that tuition has to be paid. In an instance where you're going non-operating, you are not offering those grade levels, and those students must be tuitioned to another school district. And so therefore, since they are tuition payment, the transportation would be allowed. But in that case, McCluskey could charge you for every student as the tuition calculation states in law, even if they had previously been open enrolled. Because that an open enrollment is no longer really allowed for that student.
I guess I'm a Muskie and she's Goodrich, so we're trying to figure out together. So can I claim those transportation miles for those kids that are coming over from Goodrich?
Yes, because they would no longer be an open enrollment.
What about the ones that are currently open enrolled?
I would be saying that they are no longer open enrolled because they are prohibited from open enrollment.
Would be considered, so I can claim all of the miles.
I feel comfortable saying that you could do
Even though
that.
they've always been paid one kindergarten.
Correct. Now for this year, since they're still open
Well,
enrolled,
next year,
right?
I guess.
Correct. Yep.
So I can claim everybody next year for transportation.
In that non-operating school district,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
If you're going into another school district, that would be depending on the agreement. But if it's an open enrollment into another school district, yes, correct.
So she claims that she doesn't bill us for that, she doesn't have to.
She doesn't have to bill you for the transportation.
Would we
But-
just automatically get that transportation money then?
When you submit your mileage report,
Okay.
yep. But I would say those wouldn't have to be non-reimbursable miles. Those can be reimbursable miles
Okay.
once they're non-operating.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and please feel free to reach out with any questions.